Hello, Bharat.
Hi. Hey.
For the audience, Bharat is behind you. That's why I'm not looking past you, in case you're wondering why I'm looking past you. Um, I want to start with the ending of this film, which is about Dorai. He is still alive, yes?
Yes.
You were talking about, mentioned that you all tried to track him down. Can you talk about the process of reorienting yourself and trying to find Dorai again and what he's doing and what is he up to?
Yeah. Barry, I'm going to take this one, I guess.
Yeah, please.
So basically, a lot of the tribal people that live in that part of the country, one of their primary occupations is sort of grazing livestock for wealthier and more landed livestock owners. So typically what will happen is they will find someone like a Dorai who knows the area and knows the lay of the land, and they'll sort of give him cattle and they'll get him to go and sort of graze the animals, right? And Dorai had actually moved to another village when I went back to find him. And when we went there, we went back on two separate occasions. The most recent time we went back, which was just about a month and a half ago, we'd found out that Dorai had recently been remarried for the third time, and which came as a bit of a surprise and was also a very sort of heartwarming thing, just to see how progressively sometimes the Malabar Makalar people view some of these things, like, remarrying once if your spouse has passed away or some of those things like that. So that was a 2-day long adventure, sort of tracking him down. And people don't really keep details. A lot of these people don't have smartphones. So we had to basically go around by word of mouth and find out vague names of villages and towns that Dorai could be at, and then finally catch local buses and get there and find Dorai. And I was actually happened to be sitting in a tea shop about 25 kilometers away from where he was working, and someone happened to overhear my conversation, and that's how I found him. Actually, it was quite a stroke of luck. Otherwise, it's quite possible might have returned empty-handed.
And what does he think of his presentation on screen? Like, he's seen this film, and what does he make of it? What does he make of this? Because he seems very strangely not interested in this world. The way he looks and the way he converses, but at the same time, he's so deeply immersed in it. So there's this weird contradiction when you see his presence on screen. How does he react to seeing himself being represented?
Bharat?
It's in fact when we went back and we actually showed the film to other people who've been featured in the film as well. We showed it to people in Kutriyar. I think it's a very strange experience for them to see themselves on screen, and they're used to consuming a certain kind of cinema. So this, I think it's just amusing to them. But other than that, they don't take it very seriously in that sense. They don't disagree with whatever is being shown there, because it is their lives in a certain sense. I think the film itself, the form of it and things like that are, you also have to be used to watching a certain kind of cinema in order to get it in that sense. But I think they're quite happy to see themselves on screen, and but I think it's not the cinema they used to. So it's kind of maybe it strikes them as a bit vague. They're not sure of what they're seeing.
Bharat, can you talk a little bit about the form itself and how y'all came to it? Because two things are happening in this film. Two sort of huge shifts are happening that even we are not used to seeing. One is the shift between fiction and non-fiction, between you documenting something and you fabricating something, co-creating it with all of you. And the other is the shift in the story itself, because it starts off as this journey of Dhruv and of this survey, and suddenly from the personal it becomes ethnographic, and suddenly you go to Kudriyar and it becomes about the people of Kudriyar and the social issues that they're facing. And in some sense, I feel that this switch between fiction and non-fiction makes the shift between the personal and the ethnographic almost seamless. If not seamless, it makes it more lubricated. Can you talk a little bit about how you arrived at this? Because I know that you were doing your survey and you were shooting it, and then you came in, and then cinema happened, so to speak. So can you talk a little bit about the cinema happening and how all of you came together to produce this, co-create it, so to speak?
Okay, so what I will do is I will just talk about the form of it, and then because all three of us were involved in right from the beginning, and then I let Mithun and Dhruv also talk about how it came to be and things like that. So basically in the film, when we started making it, it was supposed to be a documentary. Dhruv was actually doing the survey, and Mithun and I were helping him he had to maintain this blog, and we wanted to help him shoot some footage for it. But it's damn hard to shoot this survey because Dhruv also, he has to complete it. He's time bound. So he couldn't really spare the time for us to get him to do retakes and things like that. So, and it's also really hard. Like it's challenging, the landscape. And also we'd get stuck with things like permissions and all that. So I had this idea for docu-fiction. This is to set a fictional story in an actual place which draws heavily from the milieu, where we use actual people from there and cast them playing versions of themselves. And this is something I've been discussing with my father for a while. If you notice in the credits, he's credited with concept. And
he's the professor, right?
Yeah. He's the professor. So what happened was, because Dhruv had spent so much time in the area, it gave us this access to the people. And Dhruv is an incredibly personal chap. He makes friends like very easily. And, we'd be driving and there'll be a man grazing his goats. And he'd be like, "Hey man, that's my friend." And we'd stop the car and he'd go and he'd start talking to the guy. And he'd talk to him for a long period of time. So the sort of access we had was crazy. So we thought it would be a good idea to explore the idea of docu-fiction. Dhruv also had expressed to me in the past that he's interested in giving acting a shot. So what happened was, when we started researching the film, we started interviewing people. A lot of the interviews you see in the documentary component, if I could call it that, the switch which happens, we started doing those interviews, and we realized that we didn't know so much about a place that was so close to us. And Dhruv himself, who had spent so much time there, didn't know so many things about it. And that sort of sparked off the idea where the character himself sort of embarks on a documentary. Because it's like the people of the village are almost as alien to him as the animals he's surveying, right? So that was where this idea of him jumping that into this thing of documentary came about. Yeah.
Then do you want to add to that? Because what I found fascinating was you were shooting the vlogs for him, right? And then you also became the cinematographer of this film. And so you're shooting at two levels almost. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So
were you prioritizing, compartmentalizing?
Actually, I met him just before he was setting out on this survey, this mammal survey. And
he nearly died actually. We went together.
That's another story for another day. Yeah, but so actually
we're gonna get back to that, by the way.
So I met him, and a friend had mentioned to me about a guy who's got some forest access, and he's going to the forest to do a mammal survey. And I have some gear with me, one of them being a drone. And I was living in Kodaikanal at the time, so I was like, "Oh man, it would be lovely if I can maybe contribute by giving him some aerial footage." And it started off with that. So I randomly bumped into him at a restaurant, and he said, "Oh, I didn't know him from Adam." So he just starts telling me about what he does, and he's going on this survey. And I felt like I kind of heard this story from someone else before, and I was like, listen, if you need any help like documenting anything, like I'd be more than happy to like do whatever you need. And the thing in Kodaikanal is there is zero work for the work I do. I was always traveling to other states for work. So whenever I was in Kodaikanal, I was free. So he said, okay, let me think about it, yada, yada. A few months later, I meet him again and he's like, why don't you come with me on this thing? Just see what we do, you know? I said, yeah, sure. I'll just bring some equipment with me. And that's when we go on this journey. And it's the first time I'm setting into the forest, like legally. So I don't carry all the equipment. I just carry this GoPro with me because that's the smallest and easiest thing to carry, apart from my phone. And his things, as he kind of explained in the film, he has to do surveys in like these three...
Yeah, in grids.
Yeah,
in
like
grid cells,
basically, right? So the day I came to do the survey, the grid that he had to survey was really, really far. We typically start out at 9 and we try and be back at the forest base camp by 4 or 5 latest. Otherwise, the guards get alerted that there could be people lost in the wilderness. So we set out at 9 as planned. We reached the first point where we were going to start the survey, like from that grid, at 4 p.m. That's how long we took. And if I had a picture, I could have shown you where we were from the forest base camp to where we actually ended up at 4 p.m., which was point A. There was no way we would be able to come back down there in an hour. So we sort of made peace with the fact that we tried scaling the mountain down and we tried a bunch of things. All of that didn't really get us too far. We made peace with the fact that we're going to have to spend the night in the forest. We are hearing elephants along the way, like trumpeting as the sun is setting. And that's sort of day one of me, like just documenting some stuff for him. And then we were like, okay, he needed to make a vlog. He bought a camera. So I was like giving him a lowdown of what we can do to document things and all of that. And that's the night where like almost died and everything happened. And then we finally get back to base almost noon.
Are you skipping the story?
Yeah,
it's almost death?
I think a movie can even. It is really long actually. But the next day we get back to base camp at noon. The forest guards are like livid. They're like, where did you guys go? They were almost going to like raise a flag and like an alarm basically to like send a search and rescue team. So that happens the following day and we finished the survey, whatever we had. I go back to Kodaikanal and I give a call to Bharat because Bharat and I had worked on a few things prior. I didn't know that these guys knew each other at all. I'm like, listen, man, I got a great story in hand. There's this guy surveying the forest with a tribal assistant. And I think like, I don't know what can be made, but I was thinking of making like video profiles on people who were doing something interesting. And I thought he could be a subject for that. But then I told Bharat, I said, we could worst case do a half-an-hour video profile on a guy who is doing this, an urban guy who comes to the wilderness and is doing this mammal survey. But if anything, we could make something longer. And then he was like, this guy sounds familiar. And then he comes down and they know each other because they were in the same college. He was Bharat's junior. And that's when we start to sort of ideate on like what we could actually make because the subject matter was there. There was a lot to it actually. And that's when Bharat comes and spends some time in Kodai. We go on a few surveys with Dhruv. We see how hard the terrain actually is. And that sort of gives us a realistic understanding when it comes to how can we actually go about capturing something like this. It's not like a typical film shoot or a set where you can carry the camera of your liking and the lenses of your liking and like go to all these places with lights and like people. No, it's not such. So we sort of strategize how we can capture this firstly and what is it that we're going to capture. So we meet him over a few surveys. We don't take too much of his time though because the survey is quite intense. Once he's done with the entire survey, that's when we really started to spend more time and spend time in the tribal village. Kutriyar researched a lot over there, spent time with those guys, got the subject matter in place also. And then we started filming this. So yeah, what started off as a very small, like documenting a guy and possibly doing some drone footage in the forest ended up leading to something else entirely. But the idea was to maybe make a small episode on Dhruv, to be honest. But yeah, it ended up being like a full-fledged movie on Dhruv and what he did.
Also, just wanted to add that we also realized that once we came out of that sort of harrowing life and that experience for Mithun, a lot of the stuff that he'd gotten on GoPro turned out to be pretty good. Yeah. And it was quite indicative and quite real. It kind of lent like a visceral element to the shot making that you kind of don't see with image stabilization and like fancy cameras and things like that. And it also cut well with some of the footage that I had shot during survey as well, like, you know, because I had a small point and shoot camera and I was documenting things for my vlog anyway. And then actually it was Bharat who came up with the idea of possibly using the vlog as a storytelling device. And I think it just sort of went from there, really. I mean, to answer your question somewhat briefly.
So how much of, well, I know this is a very strange question, but at what point do you leap off from reality and fictionalize it, at least in the first half? Or were you being, so for example, like when you say he seems to be at home in the wild, when talking about Dorai, this is the voiceover and are you transcribing what you felt in that moment, or are you trying to construct this character of an outsider coming in?
I think more the second. Okay. Because I mean, I guess the honest truth of it was that I'd already lived in that place for 4 years, and I knew of I guess what the Malewal Makkalar people were capable of in their home and in that setting. And like Bharat was saying, we were all playing versions of ourselves. I mean, Dorai was of course being more himself, but I was tasked with sort of being this somewhat naive city guy who comes in there and maybe has some scientific antecedents, but beyond that doesn't really know how he's going to go about doing what he's doing. And my character is basically supposed to be like this, kind of like the representation of the city and civilization at large, right? We come in there with our plans and our charts and our sheets and we're going to do this and the protocol and this is the cell and the grid and all of that. And Dorai is like, yeah, bro, you missed the left turn. Like, you know, and so, I guess to sum up what I'm trying to say, I think like you picking out that sentence was also, I suppose, like a reconstruction of my character, like this alternate version of Dhruv that's not supposed to know this place. And in that sense, that's fiction. My mother is also still very much alive, thankfully, and but I guess maybe Bharat wants to talk about that a little, because we kind of use that as a storytelling device as well. And Barry, you want to say anything about fictionalizing the narrative and where and how?
In fact, we had a script. We had like almost a 90-page script, which we were following. So, except I think for the bit in Kutriyar where he switches to documentary, even there, based on our research, we knew the sort of responses we were going to get from people. So a lot of it was planned. This actually, and while working with Dhruv, it posed an interesting challenge, because there's Dhruv the person and Dhruv the character in the film, and they're not the same. So they would butt heads all the time, and Dhruv would, we'd get into these discussions and arguments, and he'd say, oh, I wouldn't do this. And I'd say, but you are not you. You are like a fictionalized version of you.
One thing that could have helped is not naming him Dhruv, the character.
Right. It was just, we're also, we were working... the reason I also picked Dhruv is it became a lot easier in case we were dealing with non-actors who had to converse with him, and it would give them fewer chances of error, right? Because we're working with actual relationships that he's developed, we thought we'd just keep it that way. And so it's just reduce the amount of screw-ups that could happen, right? Because we're all...
And there were many.
Lots. And... the thing is, this is the first feature film I was working on. I'm thoroughly inexperienced director. Lots of things, lots of learnings along the way. And so in that way, a lot of it was planned. It was, and I think we executed according to plan. The script that was written, I think about 90% of it is what finally made it to screen.
Bharat, there's something you did in this film, one of the switches, which I find so exciting, but also deeply reckless, in a very fascinating way, which is that you start off with the protagonist and then you just, like, you think that you're going to be with Dhruv. You think that you're going to close the circle, his relationship with his mother, for example, which you sort of seed in the beginning. And then, you midway, you're like, I don't care about Dhruv. I want to talk about the people of Kudreyar. This is a very narratively reckless choice. Talk to me about the confidence or the doubt or lack of it that you felt while saying, this is the story I want to say.
Well, I mean, so honestly, it was what was interesting to me. Even to follow those other narrative threads didn't seem as interesting, if just to be brutally honest about it. But one of the reasons I didn't actually think it through so much. It was also, I think it comes from this urge of wanting to create. And then you go a lot with instinct. And it's actually what was more interesting to me as a filmmaker. I found these things a lot more fascinating, and I thought it would make for more interesting cinema than the other threads, which I would say was somewhat more typical in that sense to follow. But no, I mean, a lot of people have, like, in the Q&A sessions, a lot of people ask me, oh, what about the survey? And I say, what about it? You surveying animals? Animals are there. You saw also animals are there. So what do you like? What do you want from the survey, in the sense? It's more sort of this reason to go into the forest and to explore the forest. He does his survey, and honestly, there is no, with a survey, you finally end up with data, right? Which is not particularly exciting for a climax or anything like that.
Do you disagree?
No, actually, no. I think I completely agreed with his creative choices in that sense. I think all of us felt that would be a better, a more interesting rabbit hole to go down. Yeah, and a less predictable one. And I think that then raises the question of, I guess, why we are creating film or art in the first place, if not for some level of personal intrigue and, I guess, yeah, just to answer some questions or some burning curiosities that we might have about things that we can't necessarily address through a conversation or as simply. Maybe we do it through taking an approach like this, where you have a real life situation and you fictionalize certain elements around it. You dramatize some things for for storytelling purposes, but and that's the story that doesn't get told. The story of the villages like Kudreyar in India and the people like Dorai are the ones that kind of they underpin my survey. I mean, I don't know if the film depicted it accurately enough, and I'm sure everybody has their own take on that, but Dorai was the bedrock on which that survey rested. That it ended up becoming a proper scientific paper. It's published. If you guys are interested, I can send you a link to it. It's like a proper 20-pager with data and maps and all of that stuff, and animal distribution and animal movements, human-animal conflict sites, the whole shebang. But there are hundreds of papers that come out like this in India from aspiring biologists, established researchers, anthropologists, wildlife guys, all kinds of fields. Any field where academia is interacting with grassroots level, with people who are on the ground, but somehow their stories never make it. And I guess, I don't know if that's the right thing to say, but I think that was one of the powerful motivators in sort of, pushing the story more towards Kudreyar and looking at what was going on over there.
How does Dorai come into the story of Dhruv, the person, and Dhruv, the character? Was he always there, and then you decided you wanted to have him as a character in the film?
Yeah, so basically when I was going to do this survey, I was already living in Kudreyar and I was working with an ethnobotanist at the time. And I had done a few excursions into the forest for shorter durations for a few days at a time, and we were gathering different kinds of like plant specimens and studying bee behavior, because that was what the ethnobotanist was studying at the time. And I happened to interact with a whole bunch of the Palir people. That's the tribe that Dorai comes from, and Dorai is a bit of a reckless guy. Even by Palir standards, he's that crazy guy who will, go and grab the beehive even though you probably shouldn't, and and the other guys will probably take a slightly more safe and measured approach. And Dorai was like this, come on man, rocket Madri, we'll do it and all that. So he had that vibe, and then when I finally got permission to do the survey, I needed to put a team together. And the initial plan was to we first of all had a very small budget. The entire survey, which is pretty much 2 years of walking around plus 3 or 4 months of me living and waiting for permissions, all of that cost us under 8 lakhs, if you will believe, including fuel and transport and everything. So our budget was tiny. And on top of that, I was expected to hire 2 people to go with me. And I was to pay their salaries and pay them a fair salary also, which was quite impossible on the budget that was. And we were also unable to find a lot of the tribal people who were in the area. They've kind of become used to living more hyper locally. There was a time when the Palir people would range across the entire Palani Hills, and they had knowledge of the entire area. But those days are 50 years ago. 50 or 60 years ago in the past now. So a lot of the people there, the tribal people from the Palani Hills, they were quite afraid of this and daunted by the prospect of having to do this. And understandably, they didn't share my adventurous mindset, because I guess they had a more realistic understanding of what that might entail, which I found out later. But Dorai was positively sort of piqued by the entire the possibility of us spending 1.5 years walking around without much human contact, like roaming around with wild animals, sounded like his dream to him. And actually, a lot of the tribal, a lot of the Palir people, I can't speak for many other groups of forest dwellers, because I guess they might have a different narrative. But a lot of the Palir people very actively know that the forest is their strength, and they do sort of look for ways in which they can work in the forest or in some way close to it or related to it. And that's kind of how I met Dorai, on another sort of study. And then I asked him later whether he would like to join mine, and he was the only guy who volunteered. And we were on a time crunch, so we kind of got started. And he's a pretty epic looking guy. He's got he's just really handsome. A lot of the Palir people are actually really good, beautiful looking people, just physically as well. And he eventually, I think, to answer your question of why we picked Dorai, was also because he got used to us, and he got used to seeing Mithun and Bharat and Chris, who's not here, who did sound, and Gaurav. And then eventually that became very important from a point of view of creating a kind of neutrality behind the camera, where he wasn't always looking for cues, and he seemed like he was more comfortable than most of the others. And so I guess he became our first choice. Yeah.
Thank you. Mithun, can you talk a little bit about the image making of this film? Because there is a way you could shoot and color correct the forests, making it look more verdant than it usually is. I love, there's this almost, you can feel the humidity of that area in the images itself. And I don't think you've tampered too much with it in terms of color correction either. It looks very natural. So can you talk about these choices that you all made about how do we show the forest?
So I actually spent just 2 years in the Palani Hills. I was staying in Kodaikanal. And one thing I realized when I was living there was that different altitudes, you notice that the greenery there, they are of different shades. Of course, there are different kinds of plants, but the altitudes have different, you find different greens in all these areas. And we have a lot of green in our film. So that was one thing. And we are going through different altitudes as part of the survey and all of that. The typical, I think the most common and cheesy way to go about it would be to really make it nice and saturated and very poppy and very beautiful in a very commercial way. We shot this all in this format called log. So it gives you a very flat profile. It was on a very small Sony camera that we shot the entire film. So it just gives you a very flat image. So when it comes to grade, you can push it up and give it a very poppy look. But since we shot it also in a very natural way without using, there are just a handful of scenes that have lights. Most of them are not even lit. It's just using natural lights. Some places we got some filament bulbs with like some butter paper and things and try to add some lights. So it wasn't really heavily lit also to like give you a sort of image that we are used to seeing. I was very clear that I want to have distinction in the shades of green, depending on the area that we are in the film, like the altitude. And then everything had to just look as, I'm going to use the word natural at this point, just for a lack of a more common word, I think. Just, it shouldn't seem like what you typically see in a film that you go to a theater and watch, you know? It just got to seem like something that when you open your door, or if you go to Kodaikanal or to the Palani Hills on a holiday, that's how it should seem. In a I don't think the human eye always pops its colors in a very saturated or in a very poppy way. So I felt like this seemed most natural, not particularly film-like. I wasn't going for that sort of look, but sure, it can seem a little like filmish sometimes because of just the colors being a little subdued. That's all. And that was the choice we made also because our approach wasn't this way. It was a very natural approach. We weren't going with all this equipment to like give you a different kind of output. And the nature of the film, like the topic that it addresses, I feel like visually speaking, color-wise, this went best. So even the colorist who came on, Shrikant Kobatu, he's also a cinematographer and he's a colorist based out of Goa. I showed him the entire film and then we had a chat about greens and blues as well, because a lot of skies. And it was a long conversation just about these two colors, like how you want to depict these two colors. So we sort of narrowed down on this being the look. And it worked in our favor also, given the approach that we shot it in. I think any other way, we would have probably had a tough time in a lot of the scenes, because it's like the campfire scenes were just the campfire. We're not using any additional light in many of the places. It's not the way typically one would go about shooting a scene for camera and everything. You'd want to have more lights just to give it that quality and that effect. But we were sort of restricted with the amount of stuff that we could even bring into the hills because it was just a 4-man crew. It was Bharat, me, Chris, and Dhruv, who's acting, and he was also handling production. And then Gaurav came in for a certain leg of the shoot. But otherwise, it was just 4 to 5 people. And you're kind of limited with what you can carry and set up and shoot and everything. So we just sort of worked within our means. And I feel like I personally like the look that we ended up with right now for the film. I feel like it suits the story, suits the place that the entire film is set in as well. So, and yeah, that's sort of how we ended with this visual look.
It also makes the movement between, so to speak, fiction and non-fiction easier.
Yeah.
Because if you want to achieve a sort of cinematic look of these forests, and then you're pairing it against these, the Rocky Pare, I'm assuming that sense of moving between genres.
It'd be jarring in a way. It already the style of shooting the docu-section is distinctly different from the first half of the film. So that itself is its thing of like, okay, we are taken away from the survey now and you're put into this tribal settlement. The color thing would completely flip things around. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for being such a lovely audience, Bharat, Mithun, Dhruv. Thank you so much for your artistry, your time, your insights. This was a lovely, lovely conversation. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone.